Well, my name is Patricia Strong and I'm a member of Rostrevor Historical Society. Peculiarly enough, I suppose nowadays you could say I was literally born in Rostrevor, because you realise that nowadays most children are born in hospitals, but I was born in Church Street because in those days you were born at home, and I grew up in Rostrevor. I went away for a short time to study in Belfast, but apart from that I have lived all my life in Rostrevor, so you could literally say I am a native as opposed to others. And I was trying to remember back my life growing up, and somebody said once that Rostrevor until the 60s really hadn't changed from about the 1900s. So if you look at old photographs of Rostrevor, you could literally, even though they're 1920s or that, you can nearly say that was what it was like in the 40s when I grew up. I went to the local convent school. It was, I think there were boys and girls at the beginning, but I don't know, I can't remember. Funny enough, you get quite sexist. But the boys then eventually at 7-year-old would have gone down to the girls' school. And my earliest memories of going to school was that we used boards and chalk. And that was how you wrote. No pencils, but boards and chalk. It was good memories and good fun. We had a couple of teachers who, I don't remember details about them, but on reflection now, when I think back, there was a particular teacher and she taught us Shakespeare, and we did Shakespeare's plays. And the two of them was, of course, obviously Midsummer Night's Dream and The Merchant of Venice. And at 8-year-old, we were sitting in school talking about Pyramus and Thisbe, or the three caskets in The Merchant of Venice. And it was an opportunity that you don't get very often nowadays. School was made up of going in the morning, coming home at lunchtime, going back in the afternoon, and then when you came home you went outside to play. I don't know if homework came into being at all, and I suppose I was comparatively lucky. I didn't have to, I was able to do it, shall we say. But there were several other girls who went to school at the same time as me who lived in the street, and of course when you came home from school the street became your playground. And again, unlike today, the street wasn't full of traffic. We had maybe the occasional car would have gone past, even a horse and cart would have gone past, and some people used bicycles. So therefore it was just a wide open space that you could make use of. The footpath outside our house, and of course the other interesting thing was my mother had a shop which sold nearly everything, most especially and more importantly sweets. But outside our house, the footpath was made up of partly cobblestones and partly like a large slate slabs. And of course they became, you could draw hopscotches on them, you could do drawings on them, you could have quiz games, and you didn't worry about chalk. You got the stones from the shore, because there were certain stones that you became familiar with when you were down at the sea that you would bring up and you could draw on the pavement. It also was you played skittles, and the occasional woman going about her shopping would have walked around you, or you stood back and let her pass, but there was no need to worry about interfering with the traffic. The other games we played were, I suppose, based more on seasons, and I was thinking back over it again there now, and one of the ones was in spring, suddenly out of the blue, and it was almost like a bush telegraph, but it was the marble season, and suddenly across the square the boys would start playing marbles, and I don't know when or how or what, and I'm not even sure wherever they bought them, but the big boys would play and us girls sort of came over and you stood and watched, and then sometimes you were allowed to join in. And there was various types of marble games. One was simply, it was almost like a golf type one. I'm not sure anybody else did it, but you made 3 holes in a long line, and the idea was to try and get your marble from the first hole into the second hole, into the third hole, and finally to den. And I think you were being stopped by other person's marbles who they would have tried to stop you getting into the hole. I think it's a vague memory of that one now, but the more important one was the playing where the marbles were in a circle inside the a ring, and of course the idea was to see, can you win marbles? And of course you went back to butts, which we call the start of it, and with a bit of luck you might get a chance to play. Sometimes the more skilled people would have been playing, and you stood there waiting but I think maybe like billiards or thing like that. Watch them clearing the field, and you were left with no chance at all. And then finally you had to pull out another marble and put it in. And the worst thing ever was when you ended up with your best, your nicest, your most precious marble, and you had to decide, do I take the chance and put it in and maybe win one or two, or do I walk away? A bit like gambling, I suppose, nowadays when I think of it. But you became quite skilled, and I remember showing some young boys and girls in recent years how to play a marble and turn it round and hit your thumb ended up being quite bruised over the time, and being able to put a spin on the marble to enable it to really go quite a distance, And then marble season was over, and you went on to some other games as the weather got a bit better, or you started playing on the street, or you played on the square. Now, when I say the square, it was a very rough, gravelly type of groundwork, and you played on it. And one of the things we used to enjoy was taking the brushes out of the house and making paths, almost like a maze, where the challenge was then for somebody else to come along to see could they find their way through the maze, because obviously you had parts that led back to den and parts that were blocked off. You also played rounders. You did all the usual games, the big ship sails through the Elialio, and night through Stocky Bluebells. So the square became something like rounders. A wee bit of cricket, not really the lovely idea of a lovely green grass and whites, but just a simply 3 sticks stuck up there, and the boys especially would have played it. That was spring. Then of course ball games. You just used the walls. You didn't have to worry about a space. There was between the various houses, between the windows, there was a space maybe of about 2 feet, and that was the wall you used. And of course the street, the curb, was a sort of a definition of how far out you went. And the games were literally throwing a ball up on the wall, and became much more intricate as the time went on. You first of all start with the ball, and then you had to do various actions. You probably don't remember. Did you ever do them? No. Well, throwing it up and then catching it, clapping, rolling, heels, toes, all that various things, and then moving further out until finally, of course, the ball fell and you were out and somebody else got their turn. And then there was another time I remember playing handball, and I fancied myself at handball, and I remember playing with a bigger boy, and we put one of the windows out, and I must admit, I let him take the blame.
And local people object to you using the wall, no?
Not at all, no. Well, it was the wall, I suppose. My mother's house was on one side and neighbours was on the other. And I don't think, you didn't do damage as such. It was, you were quite willing to stop if necessary, The only time I remember anybody objecting was during winter when we had we'd put our ice slide down. But no, most of the time I don't remember the locals objecting to the ball. I probably, maybe if the boys were playing football and might have kicked it into somebody's garden, it might have been, depending on who the person was, they might have tolerated it and thrown it back out or kept it. But the ball game, and then skipping, of course, we had skipping ropes, which were really the clothesline, and or maybe you went out more extravagant and had a really bought skipping rope which you used. But again, community group, the girls, we all played it. You had the various ones where 2 held the ends of the rope and everybody went in and did the various games like that there. Or you had single skipping ropes where but that was a bit boring because you were skipping on your own, although sometimes you could have had another person joining in. But, and then, as I was saying, one of my favourite games was Bat and Caddy. And the most interesting thing about it is that I don't know if it is anywhere else somebody has told me that it was somewhere in Derry. Somebody said it might have been in Crumlin, but I haven't heard, like, it wasn't played in Cologne. I don't think it was played in Warrenpoint. I don't think it was played in Hilltown. It seems to have been quite a localised one. And the most interesting thing I found about it recently was that I read a book about a young woman who had come from India to live in America, and in the book she was describing sitting on the wall in her Indian village and watching two of her brothers playing a game which she called, I think, Peri Peri or something, and it was the exact same description as the bat and caddy we had, you know. Now, bat and caddy required, first of all, you had to have somebody who was willing to make you a bat, because these things weren't bought. And my father was usually very good. He would get a nice bit of wood and he would carefully chisel it to form the bat. And then he would balance. I can still remember him lifting the bits of wood and feeling to see to get the right, because a good chunky one, because the more pointy the better it would bounce. So you didn't want a cheap wee bit thin piece of wood. And you had a sense of pride when you went out because you had a decent bat and caddy, not one of your sort of somebody else who didn't know how to make them just as well. And we played it on the street, and you chose, I suppose, possibly girls and boys, depending what age the boys were. I suppose the older boys wouldn't have been as interested, but young girls and boys, and you chose two teams, and one group were out, they fielded, and the other group sat on the footpath and watched the world going by, or talked or chatted till their turn came. And then you had to, there was three parts to the game. One was that you had to try and throw the stick out by using the bat, and if you were caught, you were out. But if you weren't caught, you had the choice then of the person who had caught the stick, the caddy, had to try and throw it to hit the bat, which was part up against the curb of the footpath, and if you got hit, you were out. But if you didn't get hit and it landed, because they weren't very good at throwing it, you were allowed to take your bat and then try and hit the caddy and enable it to bounce. And in the bouncing of it up in the air, you hit it and you could move it further down or away from den. And the further away from den it went, the more the challenge to the opposing team to try and jump a number of steps into den to put you out. And of course the skill was to figure out just how many steps the other person was capable of doing, or jumps, because you had some good jumpers and you had some that weren't very good. And of course you could turn, you know, the closest you could get to a jump to give you a high score, because obviously the team who had the highest score was the winning team, you know. So you played the game, and you might have played 2 innings or 3 innings, or maybe you just stopped because it was time to go home to tea. And so it was quite a good fun and quite a tolerantly game of with teams, you know. I don't know if we ever fell out with each other or anything like that, you know, but
it's quite technical. Can you explain the shape of the caddy? Because it's not a ball, it's a stick.
It was a bit like a pencil, except it was quite thick. Some of them would have been possibly as thick as my thumb, and it was pointed at both ends, which meant that when the edge of a bat came down on it, it bounced or moved up into the, yes. And depending how skilled you were or how capable you were, dexterous you were, you could, when it bounced up in the air, you could bring the bat along and hit the caddy, and then move it up the street or down the street or across wherever you wanted to. And the further, you got 3 chances at it, and the further it went, then of course the further the distance was such that one jump wouldn't do. You'd work out, was it 5 jumps, 10 jumps? There was even times when some people were so good it could have been about 20 or 30 jumps, and that was a pretty good score to add on to your team, you know. And then of course when everybody was either put out or lost or was caught out or hit out or jumped out, then you switched places. And it never went to the stage where, I think, like cricket, where you'd been bored watching it because it went on so the innings, you know. So I suppose maybe there was a mixture of both skilled and unskilled people, so it lasted maybe a couple of hours at the most, you know, during the afternoon.
Did your parents play it?
Oh no.
Generation, or was it just
And
your generation?
no, this was children, and I don't even know. I was trying to remember whether it was handed down from older ones. it was just there, you know. I never did find out whether it came from an older generation or who introduced it or what. It just seemed to have been one of those things that we played, and well, then you stopped, and I don't think anybody plays it now, you know. But it was very good fun.
Yes, it would be interesting to see in Northern Ireland.
Well, yes.
Does anybody else
I have a
remember?
feeling we called it bat and caddy, and I think somebody else might have called it piggy, maybe piggy on a stick, or, you know, I suppose the pig being the bump, the fatness of it with the wee pointed ends, you know. But yes, I would love sometime to find out whether it is a game that's played elsewhere, because like all good children's games, the rules became more elaborate. You were in control of the rules in a sense, the team, because, you know, and it could be as simple as you wanted it, or it could become more and more elaborate if you wished. I mean, for example, I remember playing it and where the girls would have jumped, just a quick step jump, but then sometimes you demanded that they had to jump with their feet together, so it became a much more serious jump, you know. And then, well, did they manage to get right into den, or did the slide or skid, you know, all those sort of things became part of the rules as you played it, you know. So oh, that's my phone. And so that was one of the games. That was summer, and then of course summer was on the beat down to the shore, and again, you know, when you think back, we went down to the shore on our own with bottles of lemonade and jam sandwiches, and you stayed all day down at the shore, and no need to worry about whether it was dangerous or not. And you came home in your bare feet after a lovely hot sunny day spent down by there, playing, catching crabs with string. And the dreadful thing was, there was one big boy. Why is it always a big boy? He tells you these things, but he said that if you hit or killed a crab, you'd find a penny in it. So there was times when there was a lot of cruelty. But then I think we realised that that was not true, so the crabs were all put back into the water again, and of course you dabbled by the shore side.
So you had the lovely loch on one side. Did you go to the hills? Did you go to the forest? Or did you
Not the forest, not that, but we had another option which is no longer in existence. It was called, there was a man called Ross who owned land in Rostrevor. Was a leading landlord, and he owned a house which is called Rostrevor House, and had grown various trees from very exotic places in the world, and they were up in what we call Fairyland, and Fairyland was up behind Cherry Hill, and you went as children, we climbed a wall, and then you had to go a path across the Cherry Hill and then go into what was called Fairyland, which was made up of quite a lot of rhododendron, which caused a lot of passages and tunnels and paths that you had to learn how to make your way through. There was also a rubber tree, there was a cork tree, and there was another area in the land which was, I think, was a lot of vines, which possibly, or even maybe it might have been ivy, but it grew across and made a huge canopy on the tops of the trees, and the bigger boys were able to climb up it because they were bigger, and that was the one thing that you hoped someday you'd be big enough to climb up and walk across the balcony in the sky. But the rest of us, we just had to be Tarzans and Janes and swing from these across on the bottom part, you know. And then the boys would have loved, there was a copse of bamboos, so that became spears. There was also, you made bow and arrows, and you had cowboys and Indians up there. But then the girls, of course, were much more feminine in those days. We had concerts, and we played with the fairies, and we made fairy houses, and constantly were surprised when we arrived back after making lovely wee moss houses that the food had gone. You know, we definitely never thought that there was possibly a mouse or something. It was definitely the fairies come out that night and eaten the food we had left. And then, of course, that was another thing we loved doing then, was concerts and reenacting any of the fairy stories you knew, you know. And my sister, I must admit, looking back, she'd always loved playing the witch or the baddie. She didn't like playing the princess or the prince, but she loved the whole idea of being really I look back now and I suppose they had more character in them, the witches, than the simpering princess, you know. But we played those, and at those days I think most old adults didn't even wear makeup a lot, and maybe if a woman had one dark red lipstick, that was possibly the total of their makeup, you know. But it was great when somebody could sneak out from the house their mother's dark red lipstick, and of course you put it on your lips, and then you wore long dresses, which were your mother's dresses, and then after you played your things, you came to the top of the hill and you rolled down. So that was your grand finale, you know. And sometimes I think you did too, the whatever was the modern plays. It was Happy Days Are Here Again, and you know the chorus. I think you might have realised that my pantomimes or something, because you suddenly realised we didn't watch television because there was no television, so the only possibly was seeing something on going to the pictures, you know. But you used to have a few chorus lines coming in and out before your plays. And I can remember one time, just now thinking about it, a young boy came from Scotland. He was over on holidays, and he came to watch our concert. And we were in a state of consternation. I think we charged him sixpence, and then we were worried sick because we didn't know what to do as part of the entertainment. I don't know what happened after that, but probably he just wrote a bad review.
It was, so all the play was outside, really?
Yes.
Or within the...
Yeah, because I mean, spring you had the marbles, summer the shore or the river was beside us too, or up the Ferry Glen. Autumn you would have had, as the evening came in, you would start playing Tigger and use the shadows as a place of hiding. But then once evening came, you went into the house and that was it. You didn't go out anymore. And apart from going in and reading or maybe listening to the radio, that was the end. Or playing games in the house. You weren't out after that. You know, there was no youth clubs. There was no places you might have. Eventually, I think Rostrevor in the 60s had a cinema, but you went to the pictures on a Saturday afternoon, a matinee, but you didn't really go out as such at night. You stayed at home at night, I think, most of us. I don't think there was anything happening then, no.
But the whole C.S. Lewis and his inspiration here for Narnia and Rostrevor, did you have any of that awareness when you were that age? You know, if your environment looking across the loch, the coolies? Oh,
well, looking across the loch, we thought that was England. And we thought there was times you could see England way down by Green Oar. No, your concept of another world, children would have come from Scotland to stay on holidays. There was a lot of boarding houses, small boarding houses in Rostrevor, and you would have some children coming over from Scotland, possibly from England, and they were very sophisticated. They even had permed hair, and you know, you looked in amazement at this sort of thing, and you might have heard of fish and chip shops, and you know, these were all quite exotic. And then of course when the moment came when you had record players and you had one record and you played it all night, you know, it was just realised how different it was, you know.
Did you venture out of Rostrevor, you know, on family days? Did you go into one point in Newry, or did you go to Newcastle?
Not so much Newcastle. You went Newry, you would have gone to Newry. Warrenpoint occasionally too, and of course Warrenpoint, you went to Warrenpoint then to go across on the ferry, because anybody who used the ferry, especially after the war, there was the most fantastically flavoured chewing gum, which anybody who you knew, if they were heading to Warrenpoint and likely to go over to Omeath, the orders went in, bring back this chewing gum. It was a pink, and it was the loveliest flavour. In fact, it was so lovely when Wrigley's, I think, became popular at that time, and it was the most bland, drab, grey-looking stuff, and you couldn't even eat it because it had nothing on this chewing gum that you could get from Omeath. Now, I don't know whether it was an American thing or what, but it was one of those specials that when anybody went over to Omeath, you loved coming back with it. We had uncles who had boats, so we would have gone maybe over a trip over to Carlingford on the boat at the St. George, and then or you'd have gone on the ferry across to Omeath with them. Warrenpoint had the town hall, and you'd have the Christmas plays, and the Fèis was there. But you went up to Newry, I suppose, for shopping, Dublin for day trips, or Dublin for the weekend, or maybe going and things like that. So I suppose that was all you did. Newcastle you would have gone to, but not, it wasn't, you know, Kilkeel maybe, down to Kilkeel but for farming days, but you know, the fair day, but nothing else, no.
Did you feel you were sort of isolated maybe from that other sort of the backside of Mourne, really?
Well, my father came from Mourne, so I had some contact with it, but no, you did look, I suppose because you went to school in Newry and the buses took you to Newry and you became more familiar with it, you faced Newry as opposed to facing Kilkeel, you know. Mm-hmm. Except I was trying to think of there now. No, I can't remember what it was about Kilkeel. No.
And at school, in breaks, was the same kind of play? Did you continue your street play at school?
I think it was more the games where you sat down and you sent a letter to my friend and you ran around, or you would have had skipping, or you would have had no, I think it was a very narrow playground. It was one of these with a wall and a small curve, and I don't think there was really a lot of space to play as such. You maybe chatted or you skipped or you did in and out through stocky bluebells and all that sort of stuff, you know. But no, there wasn't a lot of space really to play. And you didn't even go out. We went across the road and we would have drawn pictures of the boat going up the loch. But you didn't, there wasn't trips out of school to do, you know, the way nowadays children are taken to the shore or to the river or up to football fields. And of course boys, the boys probably played football, but girls didn't have any games like that, you know.
So what age did the games stop, really, you know?
Oh, the games with us, well, you know, I'm not sure, but I can remember like one winter when I was doing this, we were doing slides, because again, of course, that was, you're talking about whether people got cross with you. We used to put pour the water down the road, the main road, to cause a lovely big slide. And I mean, it shows you how there was no problem of worrying about traffic or lorries or buses or cars or anything going on it. But there was some adults who didn't like it, you know, and they used to come out and pour hot water or salt on it. But I can remember out one evening, and you're talking about what time you went in it. I suppose it must have been about 6 or 7, because really you didn't, you know, it was still quite frosty. And it's only recently I realised, of course, nowadays you don't have that because the roads are salted as soon as there's a thought of frost. But in those days you had the hoar frost and you could see the ground sparkling. But I remember seeing a girl coming down, and we asked her would she join in. And I think she might have been about, 5 or 6 years older than us. And she said no. And I possibly was 7 or 8 or 9, I can't remember. But I remember at the time thinking, imagine reaching that stage where you don't want to play, you're too grown up to play, you know. So I don't know, I think, of course, I suppose eventually you went on I left the Rostrevor school at 11 to go on to grammar school. Some of the girls in the school left, at that time they would have left about 12, and they would have gone into either the factories or into service or going into a shop or, you know, so... You know, like your childhood was quite short in a way, you know.
Yes, of course.
When you think of it, but not like nowadays, where childhood goes on for a long time.
It sounds a fabulous existence, and just play for the place.
Yeah, and what I like about it, are looking back, of course, I suppose it's like everything else. I like the way that we used things. You know, it was not a matter of having something handed to you. You created your own games, you made up your own ideas, you dressed up yourself. It wasn't sort of, you had to go and get a costume out of a shop. I mean, a costume was an old hat or a coat or a dress that your mummy had once, a bit of lipstick on, you know. You didn't have to, if you wanted a wheel, I mean, the boys would get wheels and they would have got a wee bit of rope in it and pulled it along, you know. One of the other things I can remember too, because I did it then, when I sort of had grown up a bit, but I remember speaking to somebody recently, a young boy, or not a man, and he says, do you not remember, Patricia, when you used to do this? And what happened was, when the boys of the street would have got their bicycles, and a bicycle was a very special rite of passage, you could nearly say, you know, and possibly there were about 13 of that, but all the bicycles came up to me, sitting on the step outside the door, and they all had to be customised because we got paints, and I used to do all these zigzag coloured paint down along the bars of the bicycles. So like while I was older and capable of doing that and didn't do the games, you still, in a sense, had some part of the sense of the children still playing on the street, you know.
I guess that communal play is something that doesn't really happen now.
I don't think so. I don't know, because I suppose, well, it couldn't happen on the streets, obviously, because the traffic is such now that you couldn't do it. I don't know, most people have moved into sort of bungalows, and I'm not sure whether, maybe they do go out, but of course the big thing happened was that you had playgrounds came. Like Warren Point got a playground, and we went down to see it, and you looked in amazement at these circular things and proper made swings, because our swing was a rope at the back of the house with a piece of wood made by my daddy, and our swings was a rope thrown over a branch of a tree. But you went, and these were customised things for the children to go and play it, and that hadn't happened when we were young, So again, I suppose housing estates had their own communal playground, and so the children played there, but they didn't have the freedom, because it wasn't a blank page. They didn't use them. Maybe they do, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, sometimes I look at my own children and grandchildren and realise, in one sense, history is repeating itself, They still are going, they're not going up to Cherry Hill, because unfortunately it's got houses on it now, but they go up to the woods, and they do the walking, and they do the exploring, and they climbed the trees, and they hid in the bushes, and they had all sorts of games. They go down to the shore. They didn't tuck their dress inside knickers and go out onto the beach, and maybe get one swimsuit for the year. They now have wetsuits, especially, going for a swim. But in a way, they're still doing the same things and meeting each other, except it's in a slightly different version.
Did you meet in the square, or did you call for people?
People called for me, funny enough. It was more you coming out to play, and I suppose you just went out and joined up. Yes, there was. I don't know if there may have been some times when you arranged that you all were going to meet, but at other times it just happened. And of course, you always remember the weather was good. Possibly it wasn't. There was times, I suppose, when you sail boats down the flooding, when the drains, or at least the water would run down the side of the footpath, and you watched the rain bouncing on it, and you loved that too. But no, the sun always shone those days, didn't it?
It's a fascinating time, Patricia.
Yeah, it was, And then, of course, you had books and your comics. Comics were a big thing, and books. Books were, and the radio, not the radio, but unfortunately I was a reader, and when you spoke about this here, I was remembering, again, there was no library. Books were the result of people either buying them or knowing somebody who had books. And in the school, I know this sounds strange nowadays, but in the school the books were covered. The nun, I think, or something, she'd got material, navy and green, from the Valley Dye Works, and to protect the books, they were covered in a cloth material. And I can still remember one of the teachers saying to me, I think maybe it's time you read a book without pictures. I think it must have been about 7. What Katie did was my first book reading, But, that was the books you had. Then eventually, the library didn't come to Warren Point until the 60s, I think. It was quite late on. So, and of course, there's some of the shops sold comics and annuals, but that was your only opportunity of getting games. Well, I suppose you had drafts and snakes and ladders and and snap card games, and I think that was about all. I don't know. Halloween, false faces, but that was chalk or smoke or what do you call it, soot. And then false faces became very modern, and of course the different fireworks, and you played with fireworks and you're allowed to put them off. And the square, you had a bonfire on the square, small one was built on that evening, and you danced around it wearing chalky, smoky faces and old men's hats and old men's coats, and you thought you were great, running, knocking on people's doors and running away. So I think that's it.
Times have changed indeed.
Oh, they have.
That's brilliant.
I know, but it's you don't realise just how different it is until you start talking about what has happened or what the children are doing nowadays, you know. And then you realise I suppose the 60s television, as I say, changed things, and of course all the various things happened to make people stay in their own houses. And then youngsters moved away and we became more sophisticated and we moved off to different places. It is I remember too, my father was building a pig house, and the excitement of everybody getting on the cart, when it was without sand, to go down to get the sand, and then we got off and walked home, and then he would have taken the sand on up to build do the building. But again, like life was made up. Of course, the boys would have gone for potato picking during the autumn, so that was another exciting thing. No. And the boys got 2 weeks off school too. They were allowed school holidays. Not school holiday. Well, of course, it was hard work, I suppose. I remember doing it once because my father had a couple of fields, and but we did it a Saturday morning, and we got 10 shillings, which was a lot of money for literally walking behind all the hard workers and pretending to pick them, you know. But and the big sandwiches you got. Do you remember when mugs of tea? And tea never tasted as good as it does in the open air when you had that, you know. But and I suppose some of the young boys in Rostrevor would have gone potato picking. The farmers would have collected them and taken them away.